Well, I'd like to welcome everyone again to the program, and tonight our speaker is Scott Mingus. Scott's a resident of York, Pennsylvania, and he's written over 30 Civil War books on the Civil War and the railroad, and I got a chance to catch up with him and ask how he was able to do this and write so many of these books. And he said, as an executive in the paper industry, he did a lot of traveling to Europe, and he said a lot of the time that he was able to spend writing was on his long plane rides to Europe 4 or 6 times a year. So that's pretty amazing, the amount of books. And of course, he will sign books. He bought a bunch of books if anyone would like to buy some after the talk. So tonight, one of the books we wanted, the award he just received recently was and this is from the Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable, was the Bachelder-Coddington Award, and that was for If We Strike for Pennsylvania, and he has some copies of that book. So that was a book that he wrote, co-authored with Eric Wittenberg. But tonight's focus is going to be on his new book, Unceasing Fury, Texans at Chickamauga, speaking about the role of the Lone Star troops at the Battle of Chickamauga. And I find this is a topic that's I find very fascinating, that I think, Chickamauga, Chattanooga campaign, it's a gateway to the South. It's a topic that sometimes doesn't get as much coverage as some of, let's say, maybe Vicksburg or Gettysburg, but it had a major impact, obviously, on the Civil War. And tonight he's going to talk about the role of the Texans at the Battle of Chickamauga. So would you all please welcome Scott Mingus.
Thank you very much, Scott. For sure. Can you guys hear me okay? All right. Sounds good. There have been more than 1,000 books written on the Battle of Gettysburg, 8 of which I wrote. There have been less than 30 books in print currently on Chickamauga, 1 of which I wrote. That just gives you an idea how much more Gettysburg plays in the public consciousness of the Civil War than does Chickamauga. And yet, Chickamauga, similar to Gettysburg, multi-day, 3-day battle, massive amount of casualties, lots of legendary names at the battle, and yet it remains a battle that's understudied in a lot of ways. You'll actually find far more books on Antietam, a much smaller battle, than you will in Chickamauga. Let's step back and talk a little bit. Why Chickamauga? How? Everything began with the close of 1862 and the beginning of 1863 near Murfreesboro, Tennessee. The Union Army of Tennessee, Army of the Cumberland under Rosecrans, and the Army of Tennessee under Bragg pretty much bloodied each other without a lot of really useful results, other than the fact that Bragg decides to pull back. He's going to spend much of the winter in the Cumberland Mountains and the highlands in central Tennessee. And all the time, President Davis keeps urging him to do something. Protect Chattanooga, but do something. On the other side of the coin, President Lincoln and the U.S. War Department, particularly Secretary of War Stanton, are pushing Rosecrans. You've got to do something. Both generals are getting a little tired of the interference from the politicians in Washington and Richmond, respectively, but they're finally goaded into action. Long into the late spring, finally things begin to break. Yankees are going to break through the Confederate line at Hoover's Gap and a couple other gaps. Eventually, Bragg is going to withdraw, heading his troops back down towards Chattanooga. As correctly mentioned, Chattanooga is the gateway of the South. There's your 4 railroads, by the way, that we heard about in the quiz. Keep in mind that this was a critical place for both the Confederates to hold and the Union forces to take. One of those railroads in particular heads to the East Coast. The East Tennessee Railroad, the 4th one there, is the main connection point between Richmond and Chattanooga. It's a very important railroad. Problem is that railroad is going to get blocked fairly easily when Ambrose Burnside starts bringing his 9th Corps and other troops into East Tennessee, and they'll eventually going to knock that railroad off. The other part about Chickamauga that's fairly important is it's a major Confederate supply depot and a major Confederate medical place. Lots of hospitals, lots of medical stores, spare ammunition, spare artillery, small arms. It's just a lot of stuff being stored in Chattanooga. And so Bragg has been ordered to make sure the Yankees don't take Chattanooga. What do you think Braxton Bragg does? Walks away and lets Chattanooga, leaves it alone, and starts moving his whole army across the border into Georgia, far south from where he's supposed to be, much to the consternation of Richmond. And also in the middle of this, Lincoln, still not happy with Rosecrans' performance, orders the War Department to take control of the situation. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton sends the Assistant Secretary of War, Charles Dana, on trains directly to Bragg's or Rosecrans' headquarters. It's one of the few times in the American Civil War that the Assistant Secretary of War or any other senior advisor to the President of the United States makes field visits and camps in a major army's headquarters. In fact, they string up a private telegraph line so that Dana can send messages back to Stanton reporting on what in the world Rosecrans is doing or what Rosecrans is not doing. Both those messages are getting sent back from the headquarters to Washington. The problem is both generals have now overextended themselves. Rosecrans has chased Bragg into Georgia. Both armies are strung out over a 30-mile radius in northwestern Georgia on a diagonal line that basically cuts straight across the heart of that. Both armies realize that, Chattanooga is really the goal. Bragg realizes he needs to retake Chattanooga, and of course, Rosecrans feels he needs to go back and try to hold the thing. Now, Bragg's army has a number of Texans. One of the things I like about Chickamauga, it's one of the very few Civil War battles you can tell the entire story of the battle from units from one state. Texans are literally everywhere throughout this battle. And we're going to talk about a lot of those Texans as we go forward. The first Texan we're going to talk about here is Jim Deshler. Although he's technically not a Texan, he is an Alabamian, but he commands Texas units. Now, James Deshler is an extremely good soldier. He's a West Point graduate. His best friend at West Point you might have heard of. His classmate, James Ewell Brown Stewart. Jeb Stuart and Jim Deshler are lifelong friends as a result of their association at West Point. Deshler's a military veteran. He served with distinction in California. He served in the Mormon War in Utah. He's a pretty darn good officer. His problem is, like so many of his contemporaries, he has been forced to surrender his troops at Fort Heiman at Arkansas Post, Arkansas, earlier in the year. He surrenders to William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman, of course, being from Lancaster, Ohio, strikes a conversation with Deshler. And are you related to the Deshlers from Ohio? Deshler is still the largest Ford dealer in Columbus. So the Deshler family certainly impact high name. James Deshler is an Alabamian, does have relatives in Ohio, doesn't really want to admit to it, and basically blows off William Sherman. He's that ticked. He doesn't even want to talk to his captor. He and his men are sent to Camp Douglas. Where? In Illinois, right down the pike. They're sent to Camp Douglas, and after they're paroled in exchange, they are brought back into the Army of Tennessee. Much like Willard's brigade at Gettysburg of New Yorkers who had surrendered at Harper's Ferry, the Army does not accept these guys coming back. Army of the Potomac called Willard's brigade the Harper's Ferry Cowards. Similarly, here, these guys will always be the Arkansas Post parolees. That's one of the nicer names you'll find in the literature about these boys from the other disclaimer is these guys are cavalrymen without horses. They started the war on horses, but Texas, believe it or not, has had a shortage of horses. They have plenty of cows, apparently, but not enough horses. And so they're going to dismount many of the Texas cavalry regiments, and they're now fighting as infantry. They're being given Enfields or Springfields or other kinds of rifles, and they are fighting on foot using cavalry tactics. They're not mounted infantry, they're still cavalrymen, but they're at least going to give it a shot. They are also associated with Douglas's Texas Battery. That will be the only battery from the state of Texas to ever cross the Mississippi River and go east during the Civil War. They're going to fight at Franklin, they're going to fight at Nashville, etc. In 1864. Here in 1863, Douglas's battery, of course, is going to be involved in Georgia. On the right is the total antithesis of Jim Deschler. Remember, Deschler's a professional soldier, very highly regarded within the Army. On the right is Matthew Ector. Matthew Ector is the epitome of a political appointee. He's an attorney, a pretty good one, before the war. His wife has recently died, and in his grief and mourning, he becomes a party animal. He will stay up most of the night drinking and dancing with every young girl that they can find. In fact, he wears his young staff out. His staff officers give up by 2 o'clock in the morning, and they're in bed, and Ector's still out dancing until dawn. Not the best military officer by any stretch of the imagination, but he's got some really good troops underneath him. Most notably, the 9th Texas Infantry. Very solid regiment, well commanded. He's got as well 3 regiments of dismounted cavalry. Much like the men of Deschler's guys, they don't have horses, so they're going to fight on foot. The other part of the Army of Tennessee that we're going to know tonight is the Texas Rangers. They're commanded by Tom Harrison. Tom Harrison, again, not a Texas native. By the way, most of the soldiers from Texas in the Army of the Potomac, or Army of Northern Virginia, and the Army of Tennessee are not natives of Texas. Most of them have moved to Texas from parts of the South at the point of the war. This guy, Tom Harrison, lives in Waco. He is, again, kind of a blend between Deschler and Ector. He is a lawyer politician like Ector, but like Deschler, he's got considerable military experience. Fought in the Mexican War, fought a number of Native Americans in different border fights in Texas. And of course, his most famous unit on the right, the Chicago History Museum, has the flag of the Terry's Texas Rangers in their collection. These guys have horses. So do the 11th Texas Cavalry. They are the only 2 regiments of Texas Cavalry in the entire Army of Tennessee that have horses. Everybody else is dismounted. The other 9 regiments of cavalry are dismounted to fight. Now they're getting reinforcements. Bragg has asked for new troops. He's worried about Rosecrans' strength. He's worried about the fact that he doesn't think he can hold Chattanooga. He's already pulled out of there. And he desperately calls on Jefferson Davis and Secretary of War James Seddon looking for reinforcements. Reluctantly, the War Department sends him an entire division out of Joseph Johnston's Army of Mississippi, which then is encamped at Enterprise, Mississippi. These units, known as Bushrod Johnson's Provisional Division, they are going to join the Army of Tennessee. Among their officers is John Gregg. John Gregg is my version of John Wayne. This guy moves to Texas, Alabama native, big, tall, strapping guy, 6'3", 6'4", very tall for his age. extremely robust, very aggressive, not a military man, but a born fighter. John Gregg, again, to use the analogy, John Wayne. He is a professor. He's a congressman. He's a congressman that knows how to fight. He's got one Texas unit in his brigade, and this is the single best Texas regiment in the Army of Tennessee. It's the 7th Texas. Any guys ever been to Franklin, the battlefield, where my 15-year-old at the time great-great-grandfather fought in the 51st Ohio and was the last Civil War veteran left in East Central Ohio when he died in 1937. My mom was 13 at the time, so we have lots of one-generation stories away from the actual Civil War. But Hiram Granberry is one of the 6 generals that are laid out dead on the porch at Franklin. So that's the name. He's going to be a general a year from now. Right now, he's a colonel, and probably the single best colonel from Texas in the Civil War, at least at this point in the war. So Gregg's men have arrived, as well as the rest of Johnson's boys, a lot of guys from Missouri, Arkansas, places like Mississippi, places like that. So Bragg he's happy, but he's not really happy yet. He needs even more men. He continues to send messages back to Richmond. I appreciate this. Why don't you send me Johnston's whole army? Well, they're not going to do that. And then he says, why don't you send me Robert E. Lee? Well, that's not going to happen, except the War Department decides, you know, we're not going to send you the Army in Northern Virginia, but we can spare a corps from the Army in Northern Virginia. So they put on trains Longstreet's Corps, 1st Corps. They're going to start heading to Richmond to be embarked on trains heading to the south. While all this is going on, Bragg and Rosecrans finally clash. They've been avoiding a fight for most of the summer. It's now September. The weather's turned miserable. It's icy cold. There's a massive cold snap. You can read about it in the Chicago newspapers of September 1863. Temperatures well below 0, dipping all the way to Florida. It's amazing. Cold snap just dips down right through Georgia, Tennessee, all the way down to the Panhandle. This is Lookout Mountain. Guys probably have been to Lookout Mountain by Chattanooga. This is in Georgia. Lookout Mountain is a very, very long, very high range. There is a mountain pass right up here that you can climb up and over. And that's what the Union forces have been doing. They're now arrived in McLemore's Cove, much like Cade Cove down in the Smokies. This is a very large grassy area filled with wildlife, etc. It's also going to be the site of the opening moves of what will become the Battle of Chickamauga. Recognize this guy? Patrick Cleburne, born on St. Patrick's Day. A former officer in the British Army. He is a Protestant Catholic, has moved to the New World, commands Confederate troops. Cleburne is Jim Deschler's commander. Deschler's brigade is in Cleburne's division. They are on top of Pigeon Mountain. Down in McLemore's Cove, directly to their north, are Union troops under Pap Thomas. He's going to send Nagley's brigade into the Cove, up and over Stevens Gap. Up here is Crittenden, but you look how separated Rosecrans' army is. Braxton Bragg finally decides, I've got an opportunity to strike. I've got isolated Union forces here. If I can get down and defeat them, then hit Thomas as he comes over the gap, I can split one of the 3 Union corps off from the army and beat it in detail. At least that's what Cleburne and Bragg believe. Cleburne's men are going to go screaming down off the mountain. They're going to attack Nagley's force at Davis's Crossroads. Again, bloody fighting occurs, not a whole lot of material results. Crittenden is certainly, or sorry, Negley certainly not destroyed, and Cleburne will eventually pull back up onto the mountain. What this little tiny fight at Davis's Crossroads does is it sends both Rosecrans and Bragg into full-blown retreat mode. Both of them are going to start heading northeast as fast as they can, heading towards Chattanooga. They, of course, are going to meet. The two parallel paths are going to narrow along West Chickamauga Creek. In the meantime, while all this is going on and the two armies are going there, Longstreet's boys are on trains. Now, James Longstreet has been ordered to send his entire corps, minus one division, which is still retrofitting. Which division do you think that is? George Pickett. Pickett's men will not be put on trains. The other two divisions will be boarding on trains, as well as every single piece of artillery from Longstreet's entire corps. The problem is the Southern Railway system. The gauges don't match. Far too often on this journey, trains have to unload, take everything off, march through little towns, reload them onto another train that has a different gauge, proceed on down the road for 50 miles and do it all over again. Meantime, the first train is turned around and steamed back north. As a result of this movement, not a single piece of Longstreet's artillery will arrive in time for Chattanooga or Chickamauga. Not one. Many of his men will not arrive in time for the battle. James Longstreet himself will not arrive in time for the start of the Battle of Chickamauga. They're still on trains, strung out. And the problem is, as I alluded to earlier, the East Tennessee Railroad. Remember I said that's the direct route from Richmond to Chattanooga. Well, Burnside's men are sitting right on top of the railroad. So there's no way in the world you can send Confederate troops from Richmond to the west. They have to go south. They go down into North Carolina and even to South Carolina, and they're going to take trains to the west through Augusta into Atlanta, and then from Atlanta on the Western and Atlantic Railroad to the north up to Catoosa Platform and Ringgold Station in northwestern Georgia, both of which are famous from the famous episode a year previous to that with the Western and Atlantic Railroad called Andrew's Great Locomotive Raid. All right, Longstreet's boys are heading there. One of the first brigades to get on a train in Richmond is Hood's Texas Brigade. 3rd Arkansas and 3 regiments from Texas. John Bell Hood's not with them. John Bell Hood, as you probably all know, has been grievously wounded at Gettysburg. He is under doctor's orders, basically, not to travel. He's there on his horseback, watching his men board the train, supervising everything, and then watches the trains steam out. When the last train of Texas has departed, he turns to leave and has a change of heart. The next group of trains to arrive are going to take Benning's Georgia Brigade. Again, guys who fought at Gettysburg, to Georgia. What does John Bell Hood do? Jumps on board the Georgians' train. Remember, he's the division commander. He's got the right to do it. But the men are wildly cheering for John Bell Hood, but the Texans have no clue that Hood's following them to Georgia. The first of the Texas Brigade arrives on September 17th. 1 year ago on that day, what happened in Maryland? Antietam. Exactly 1 year after Antietam, where the Texas Brigade is shot to pieces in the cornfield, loses every single member of their color guard, and an amazing disaster in the cornfield. 1 year later, the rebuilt Texas Brigade is on trains and arriving at Catoosa Station. They are hot rushed into action by their new commander. Same guy at Gettysburg, of course. John Bell Hood, when he was elevated to division command, has given the brigade command to Jerome Bonaparte Robertson. Robertson's son, by the way, Felix Robertson, is the chief of artillery for the Army of Tennessee. Why do I mention Felix Robertson? He's the only general in the Confederate Army born in Texas. Every other general from Texas is born somewhere else. But Felix Robertson is born, he's a young man, he's only in his 20s, born in Texas. So again, 1st Texas, 4th Texas, 5th Texas, 3rd Arkansas. We're all familiar with these guys from Gettysburg, of course. They are tired. They are worn out from the long trip. They're going to be held in reserve. The key to Chickamauga, to understand the battle, is to realize you got two parallel armies coming to a point, and then they're going to zip from that point back together as the lines are going to coalesce. Now, the problem for the Texans is they've just been issued brand new uniforms. These reenactors have got it right. They are issued blue jean material for the uniforms. Hood's vaunted Texans arrive on the field at Chickamauga dressed in uniforms that look like Yankees. They're brand new uniforms. They look like rookies coming off the train. Everything's crisp and fresh. And these veterans from the Army of Tennessee take one look at these newcomers from the East and they howl in derision. Bunch of pansies. And then they finally realize that's Hood's Texans? Looking like that? That was not exactly what they expected Hood's Texans to look like. Certainly not looking like Dapper Dan's. They expected guys with horns and devils. No, they get guys in brand new uniforms. So the Texans are put in reserve initially. So here's the two armies. This was one of your quiz questions. Man, the quiz was absolutely brilliant, by the way. 60,000 people versus 65,000. Both armies have 3 corps and a reserve corps. Both armies have cavalry, but one of the things you'll notice is the Confederates have 2 separate cavalry corps. Why? Fighting Joe Wheeler doesn't like Nathan Bedford Forrest. And Nathan Bedford Forrest doesn't like fighting Joe Wheeler. So they divide the cavalry between them. Terry's Texas Rangers are part of Joe Wheeler's men. So, day 1 at Chickamauga. This is West Chickamauga Creek coming down through here. You got a few crossing points. Lee and Gordon's Mill, very icy ford. West Chickamauga Creek flows from Lookout Mountain. Remember the cold snap that I talked about earlier? This is an ice cold, very swift moving stream. Extremely fast moving with very steep banks. One of the few places you can wade across in water that goes up to your armpits is at Lee and Gordon's Mill. Continuing upstream, there's a couple other fords. They're not in play right away, but you've got 2 key bridges. This is where the Yankees are going to defend, Alexander's Bridge and Reed's Bridge. So let's talk about the opening moves at Chickamauga. Here's John Wayne. John Gregg, sorry. John Gregg, the Confederate congressman, heck of a fighter. He's going to launch the first attack on Reed's Bridge. Any of you guys military veterans here, please raise your hands. Thank you for your service, and I mean that sincerely. Now, for you military guys, you've got a wooden plank bridge between you and the enemy. You're going to pull up the planks. On which side of the creek are you going to put them? On your side or on the enemy's side? Which one are you going to do? Your side. Which one did they do? The Confederate side, of course. They pile up all the planks, and all the rebels have to do is bend over under sharpshooter fire, mind you, and replank the bridge. And they come storming across into the teeth of the Chicago Board of Trade Artillery. You guys have heard of that, I'm sure. There they are, banging away, 2 guns. Board of Trade, 1 section, banging away as the Confederates come across. Here's John Gregg with the 9th Texas coming in here. Here's Hood's Texans. Back here, Robertson's brigade in reserve, not doing much. The Confederates are going to force the issue. They're going to storm across the bridge. James Minty, commanding the Union forces there, has cavalry from U.S. regulars. He's got guys from Michigan and from Pennsylvania, and they will turn around and leave. To the south, things are not going as well for the Confederates at Alexander's Bridge, where they are running smack dab into John Wilder's Lightning Brigade. Troops again, Illinois, Indiana, etc. The Lightning Brigade will be noted for being able, the Confederates will say that they can load the guns on Sunday and fire all week long. 20-shot guns. And they're holding the Confederates off very, very nicely at Alexander's Bridge until the order comes to Wilder to withdraw. With the loss of these 2 bridges, the Confederate Army starts pouring across West Chickamauga Creek overnight. 1 full third of the Army of Tennessee will cross the creek that night. Hood's Texas men are camped very close to to Gregg's and Ector's brigades. And so a lot of these Texas boys are seeing family members they had not seen, nor are they expected to be seen. And a lot of these Army of the Tennessee Texans are stunned when in walks the men from the 4th and 5th and 1st Texas. They had no clue they were on the battlefield, especially dressed in the way they were dressed. But they're at least on the field. That night, the Battle of Chickamauga has what up to that point was a relatively rare night fight. The 7th Texas on John Gregg's men are going to fight against Wilder in the middle of the wilderness, the battlefield. The photograph on the left shows the extreme flank of the 7th Texas's position during the night fight against Wilder. What this night fight does, again, Bragg and Rosecrans are apprised of this, and they continue to move their armies as fast as possible to the northeast as they continue to concentrate their widely scattered forces. On the morning of the 19th, the attacks start in earnest on September 19th. Our buddy Nathan Bedford Forrest launches an attack from Jay's Mill into the woods. He brings Matthew Ector, the party boy. He brings Ector's men into the play. They're in the middle of the woods, and all of a sudden, Ector's men are sent back. Forrest's men withdraw. They push back to the Jays Mill Road, and then they're going to regroup. We're going to try it a second time. Matthew Ector orders his men forward, and on they go, back into the woods. By now, the smoke is getting really thick. They cannot see a Union counterattack coming on their left flank. Here's Matthew Ector up here. Here's John King's regiment of U.S. regulars. They smash into the flank. Matthew Ector, a politician, hits the panic button. Only some very skilled maneuvering by his adjutant and some of his colonels managed to rescue Ector's brigade. They're going to fall to the rear, and Ector will no longer be much of the action, at least on September 19th. They're going to be in reserve most of the day. So again, if you picture that zipper, the 2 armies coming together at a point, and now they're closing in. Throughout the day of September 19th, the action goes from the north part of the battlefield, almost in echelon, down to the southern part of the battlefield as these 2 armies continue to collide. Lots of guys are being shot. Neither Bragg nor Rosecrans have a strong feeling of what's happening. Chickamauga is often said to be a soldier's battle because in many cases, all the command structure breaks down in this smoke-shrouded wilderness, almost as bad as the wilderness in Virginia, if not worse in places. And then everything just falls apart and it becomes a matter of survival for individual soldiers. As this battle continues to zip to the south, James Longstreet has arrived on the scene. Longstreet is ticked. His train has arrived in the middle of the night. He expects to find an escort for him, sent by General Bragg. How many men do you think meet him at the train station? Raise your fists. Nobody. Longstreet thinks this is unbecoming of a lieutenant general. I mean, he's James Longstreet, for heaven's sakes. And this is Braxton Bragg. And Bragg's not here to do anything. He finally manages to find Bragg's headquarters. Where's Bragg? Asleep. Which again ticks Longstreet off. Bragg wakes up, talks to Longstreet, gives him a cursory understanding of the battle. James Longstreet has been at Chickamauga for all of an hour. And then he learns, you're going to command the center tomorrow in the attack. Longstreet doesn't even know who the other officers are. He doesn't have an order of battle. He just now knows he's been thrust as a lieutenant general. You're going to take command of a certain portion of the line, bring your men up, and oh, by the way, most of his men are still on trains, but he's at least going to try through the night. When morning arrives on the 19th, Longstreet is finally into play, heading onto the battlefield. That afternoon, here comes Robertson's brigade, Jerome Robertson's brigade. John Bell Hood has arrived. His men are wildly cheering. The Texans cannot believe their eyes. There's John Hood. General Hood's here. Viva Hood! They're happy. They're giddy with excitement. John Bell Hood, left behind in Richmond. Here he is in flesh. And Hood says, go in, boys. And they go in. Cheering the Texas yell. War whoops. Here are the boys from the Army of Northern Virginia in their best clothes, now showing the Confederates from the Army of Tennessee how Easterners fight. Problem is, they're fighting in the woods. They're not used to fighting in the woods. Wilderness is a year away still. This is 1863. They're used to Gettysburg, Antietam, Fredericksburg, places with lots of open ground to maneuver. Not this wasteland of Northwest Georgia. But they're going to give it a go and at least get going. While that's happening, as they go into the woods, they discover John Wayne, laying on the ground, badly wounded. They will pick up his body. He's rolled into some underbrush so the Yankees can't find him. Hood's Texas boys pick him up, not realizing that a year from now, John Gregg will command the Texas Brigade and will die in the Overland Campaign of a gunshot. But here, the Texans rescue him at least. Hood's men go in like a hammer, as they usually do. The Texans make a spirited charge. This is Bruce Marshall's wonderful painting of the Vineyard Farmhouse. This is the first Texas attacking it. They're going to get multiple opportunities to break the Confederate line or Union line, none of which work. They're attacked by boys from Kansas, boys from Wisconsin, Colonel Hans Haig's boys. We just talked about them last night in Milwaukee. They're shot to pieces. Most of the boys under Haig's brigade are going to fall back. An Indiana artilleryman by the name of Captain Eli Lilly, yes, the Eli Lilly, will manage to waste a lot of Texans with canister shots, finally forcing the Texans to withdraw. There'll be troops coming up to their left from Florida, but by and large, the Texans and Benning's Georgians are pretty much repulsed on September 19th. Texans aren't real happy about that. The Texans had not been repulsed very often, but now it's 2 in a row. They've been repulsed at Little Round Top, and now they're repulsed on their very next battle 3 months later in northwestern Georgia. All throughout the day, the sound of the guns have been echoing off the Tennessee or Georgia hills. Both armies are sending forces as desperately and as fast as they can to the rescue. Among the troops are Patrick Cleburne's division. Up on Pigeon Mountain, they hear the sound of the guns. A courier comes and says, "Get your butts marching." Deschler's brigade, the other brigades of Cleburne's division, force march down from the mountain into the valley, make it to Lee and Gordon's mill, and they are going to hold their guns over their heads in this chilly water up to their armpits, and they're going to arrive in cold, wet uniforms right at dusk. Patrick Cleburne's men see the detritus of battle all around them. Wounded men, men in reserve who won't go forward. They're going to march right past them, get into position, and Cleburne's going to launch a night attack. Remember, we had a night fight the night before? That was one regiment against a brigade. Now we've got divisions against divisions. Here's Deschler's dismounted Texas cavalry charging into Dodge. Yes, that's the Dodge City. They're going to attack through there. Leonidas Polk's little brother, here's Sam Wood. Lots of attacks going on in Winfrey's Field all throughout the night. A Russian-born U.S. officer, Ivan Turchinov, John Turchin, comes into play as well, coming in. The night fight by Cleburne is vicious, hard fighting. He's going to push back multiple Union brigades. The problem with this part of the battlefield is it hasn't rained in weeks. Everything is bone dry. What do you think artillery fragments do in hot grass, dry grass, or in dry pine trees? Pretty soon, pine trees are on fire, the grass is on fire, and just like the wilderness a year later, soldiers are dying in the inferno. Entire aid stations are burned. Every single soldier that went to an aid station dies as this inferno continues. Battle finally halts for the night. Both armies, Bragg and Rosecrans, say, nobody's lighting a campfire. Why? They're 40 yards apart in places. You're not going to light a campfire, you're going to die, or at least be shot in the shadows. So everybody's freezing to death without campfires. Cursing Bragg, cursing Rosecrans, most of them wishing they were back in Texas or Illinois or Indiana or Ohio or wherever, any place but northwestern Georgia. On the morning of September 20th, Cleburne launches another attack. Typical Irishman. Off he goes. They're going to take about half mile worth of ground, and then they're going to come to a small ridge under the teeth of Ohio and Indiana artillery. Deschler's brigade, in fact, Cleburne's entire division, are going to go to ground. James Deschler will be walking. Then all of a sudden, he's crawling from unit to unit. His boys from Arkansas and Texas telling them, you're almost out of ammunition, scrounge from whatever wounded men you can, save your ammunition, and shoot only if you know you can kill. Deschler's crawling on all fours when an unknown artillerist, probably an Indiana battery, spots him and puts a cannonball into his chest. James Deschler dies instantly. Jeb Stuart, when he gets the word of the death of his college buddy at West Point, weeps. More importantly and more interestingly, Robert E. Lee breaks down in tears. As far as I can tell, this is the only time in the Civil War Robert E. Lee is emotionally distraught over the death of an officer in the Army of Tennessee. It's not one of his officers, mind you. It's James Deschler. But Deschler is that beloved in the Army. And it's a guy you never heard of other than the quiz tonight. James Deschler, dead. That's his memorial. Deschler is going to be replaced by Colonel Roger Mills, another hellfighter, a very, very talented officer. Mills is going to take over, but the men are pinned down. They really can't do much. In fact, Bragg's whole army can't do much. Longstreet on the scene, trying desperately to get these men moving, has to introduce himself to people like his subordinates, Frank Cheatham, for example, Thomas Hindman, A.P. Stewart, Patrick Claiborne even. Here's William Preston. I mean, Longstreet is now in charge of all these guys. He knows John Bell Hood. That's a recognizable name. He doesn't know any of these other guys at all. Doesn't know them. And yet he's got to issue orders to most of these guys in the Army of Tennessee. Keep fighting. Go forward. And in the middle of this, as was pointed out in your quiz, Thomas Wood's division marches to the northeast. Why? The armies have been marching northeast. He pulls out a line, opens a huge gap in the Union line at Brotherton Cabin. And the Confederates are going to pour through that. A young, fiery little Bantam Irishman by the name of Phil Sheridan grew up 10 miles from me in Somerset, Ohio. Phil Sheridan, an infantry division commander at Chickamauga, not a cavalryman. That time leads a spirited counterattack. One of his brigades is led by William Lytle. There was a book today passed out on the William Lytle, the poet of Ohio, is killed during the countercharge, but Sheridan's men will pick off most of the Confederates pouring through the hole and turning south. The problem is this huge gap in all the Confederates that are going to pour through and turn north towards Chattanooga. That's the problem area. And who are those troops? The Army of Northern Virginia's First Corps. By now, Hood's Texans have been joined, and Benning's Georgians have been joined by Wilcox's Alabamians. Vanderlaw's Alabamians. They've been joined by Benjamin Humphrey's Mississippians, formerly commanded by William Barksdale, who died at Gettysburg, of course. Joe Kershaw, South Carolinians have now arrived. All these names you know from Gettysburg. They're now in the field at Chickamauga, and they are under Longstreet's direct command. They trust Longstreet. And for everybody who thinks James Longstreet is a defensive general, look what he does at Chickamauga. He is a hammer. He orders his men forward. I don't know about these Army of Tennessee boys, but you guys in the Army of Northern Virginia, take that position. And they fly through the hill, fly through the hole. They're going to go running through North Dyer Field fast as they can. Almost a mile. This is what the Texans have loved. There's open ground. This is the east. Off we go. And Hood's Texas boys, followed by Benning's Georgians and Kershaw South Carolinians, go roaring through North Dyer Field. Everything looks good. They're going to capture a bunch of artillery, except up here on this knoll. Here comes Yankee troops, mostly Ohioans, coming onto that knoll, shooting at the Texans. They hit the Texans hard. They hit them in the flank. Hood's boys cannot stand it. And again, for the third time in a row, Hood's Texans are repulsed. Little Round Top, Vineyard Farm, and now North Dyer Field. Back go the Texans across there into Dyer's Woods and the safety of the woods. John Bell Hood tries to rally him. What do you think happens to Hood? He takes one in the leg. John Bell Hood, thought to be dying, is going to be escorted into about 20 miles or so to a farmhouse where he'll eventually recover, much to the surprise of everyone else. but Hood's down. Evander Law, just like at Gettysburg, takes over the division. And about this point in time, Rosecrans leaves. Now, the official thing is he's overworked, he's frazzled, he's tired. He says he went to Chattanooga to prepare the defenses because Charles Dana, the Assistant Secretary of War, said Chattanooga is important. And Dana's headed there himself. And his chief of staff, whose name is what? James Garfield, takes off with him. So does John Crittenden. So do a lot of Union officers. The Army's starting to melt. And about that time comes the only Virginia-born Union general at Chickamauga. What's his name? George Thomas, known as Pap, also known as Old Slow Trot in some things. My ancestors, almost to a man, fought for Pap Thomas during the war. I got nothing but good things to say about Pap Thomas, but the U.S. War Department didn't really like the guy. He's a Virginian. He cobbles together as many troops as he can on Snodgrass Hill, Hill number 9, number of other hills, and here is his defensive line. At the same time, the remnants of the Army at Kelly Field are forming a horseshoe. And here are our Texans. There's Hector back in action, party boy. Here's Roger Mills, now in charge of Deschler's brigade under Claiborne. Here's Robertson with the Hood's Texas Brigade. Here's Sugg, now in command, a Mississippian, now in command of John Gregg's brigade. So multiple attacks are being launched on all parts of the field by Texas soldiers, as well, of course, of soldiers from other states. Hood men put out of action makes a difference here like it does at Gettysburg. The attacks are going to fail. Every single attack fails throughout the day as Thomas's men manage to hold on. So we all know George Thomas, Pap, gets a new nickname that will live forever, the Rock of Chickamauga. He probably saves the Army of the Cumberland almost single-handedly at Chickamauga. Everybody goes flying back towards Chattanooga. It's a foot race, which the Union Army wins. They're going to get into Chattanooga. Bragg's going to follow them up, and they will start laying siege. Another quiz question. So funny, we didn't rehearse this. Chickamauga, the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War, almost 35,000 casualties at Chickamauga, mostly on the Confederate side, but an incredibly bloody battle. As a direct result of this battle, there's a number of things happen to Chattanooga. Longstreet and Bragg don't like each other, and Longstreet is sent east. Bragg managed to work the War Department to say, you know, we need the East Tennessee Railroad open up. We need Knoxville to return to Confederate control. Why don't you send Longstreet? And so the Army of Northern Virginia boys will forever leave the Army of Tennessee. They're going to head back to Knoxville, where they will be unsuccessful in taking the town, and eventually they're going to retreat back into Orange County, Virginia, where eventually they will rejoin the Army of Northern Virginia for the rest of the war. Rosecrans is dead man walking. U.S. Grant shows up to relieve him. Grant's going to bring his buddy, William T. Sherman, out of Mississippi with him. He, too, is screaming for reinforcements, and like the War Department at Richmond, the War Department in Washington sends Gettysburg troops to the west. The entire Oliver Howard's 11th Corps and Slocum's 12th Corps will leave the Army of Potomac, never to return, and will be reassigned to the Army of the Cumberland, temporarily at least for that. Finally, after the attacks on Missionary Ridge, Orchard Knob, etc., Lookout Mountain, the siege of Chattanooga is lifted. Grant wins a massive victory. Most of Bragg's subordinate officers are fed up. Finally, the War Department replaces him. They go down to the Army of Mississippi, and they call in Joseph Johnston. We all know what happens in 1864 as Chattanooga becomes the launching point for William T. Sherman marching into North Georgia a second time. And this time they're going to take Atlanta, as we all know. For the Texans who fought at Chickamauga, it remains a seminal event. The Texans of Hood's brigade have Gettysburg, but almost everybody else, Chickamauga is the biggest battle they'll ever fight in their life. Most of those Texans, for them, it's a matter of pride. Texas soldiers left over 600 letters concerning Chickamauga, which Joe Owen, my co-author, who is the ranger at the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Ranch in Texas, Joe mined all those letters and I turned them into a book. But these Texas boys thought that there should be some sort of memorialization. So in 1893, Roger Mills, the guy who replaced Deschler, James Douglas, the only Texas artillery unit, and a senator who'd been a member of the Texas Brigade, O.P. Bowser, show up in Chickamauga and they mark all the positions. They can't find where Ector fought. A lot of people couldn't find where Ector fought or didn't fight, but they find everyone else, and they're going to recommend a state monument in 1893. One by one, the Texas boys who fight at Chickamauga drop of old age, disease, etc. Wiley Wood Foster dies in 1946 after World War II at the age of 101. He fought at Chickamauga in the 18th Texas Dismounted Cavalry. He's the last known Texan from Chickamauga. In fact, he may be the last Confederate soldier who fought at Chickamauga. That's a little bit of a dispute as to who it was, but Foster's right up there. Last guy to die. 1893, they finally get their monument. When? 1964. We have to go all the way to the centennial before they finally get their monument. Oh, by the way, it looks like every other Texas monument. They all look the same. The words are different. But in the 60s, they put it in Antietam, they put it at Gettysburg, everywhere else the Texans were at, Spotsylvania, etc., they all look alike. On behalf of my publisher, Ted Savis, my co-author, Joe Owen, and on behalf of the 4,000 Texans who fought at Chickamauga, have a great night. And one last favor, if I may. We Civil War authors, I know, Rob, there's several of you in the audience, do not like you going to Amazon when books are in the back. So tonight, for you guys, Amazon's current price is $29.99. Look at my price tonight, and you don't have to be a Prime member. Just flash a smile on a $20 bill. I'll meet you in the back. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot. Do you have a second for a couple of questions?
Yeah, we got time for any questions. Go ahead.
Any questions?
Yes.
These are not so good. I thought I heard you say that the dismounted cavalry attempted to use cavalry tactics while they were dismounted.
At first, they continued to use cavalry tactics. By the time of Chickamauga, they're armed with rifles and they're using infantry tactics. But for the first 6 months, yeah, they're trying to become cavalry still. What's that? Not well. That's why they ended up as infantry. Not well at all. Yeah, because if you think about it, they're going dropping back into formation with horse holders. One out of every 4 men looks around and says, "Why am I back here? I don't have horses." He walks back up. So you got all this cavalry stuff going on. You got to break them of this cavalry mentality and teach them infantry tactics, and that's what they do over this. It's the one thing Bragg does accomplish. It's especially, they're going to do a marvelous job of putting these guys whipped into infantry shape. Great question. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah, Mark. He gets the credit. He's certainly not the only officer there. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Granger's men certainly do that. They do a fine job of that. Thomas gets all the publicity, certainly, for that. We don't even talk about Gordon Granger, hardly at all. But yeah, he's there on point. Yeah, a lot of Illinois boys and guys from Iowa and Indiana as well. Okay, thanks so much, everybody. Books are in the back. Have a great night.
Great meeting with Scott. Thanks a million for.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Great talk. You know,
Ah, thank you.
say that. Yeah, that's.
There you
how did
go.
that come together when you and Joe